Imagine a time when doctors prescribed cigarettes for your health. Hello, you're on the channel 33 Facts. Here we share amazing stories, scientific misconceptions, and unexplained facts. Get comfortable. Let's begin. First fact: smoking was once prescribed by doctors. In the 1930s and 40s, physicians actively recommended cigarettes to their patients. Tobacco companies hired doctors to appear in advertisements, claiming that certain brands soothe throat irritation and improve digestion. Philip Morris advertised their cigarettes as being recommended by doctors more than any other brand. Medical journals published tobacco ads showing physicians in white coats holding cigarettes, assuring the public of their safety. Some doctors even suggested smoking to pregnant women to calm their nerves. The tobacco industry sponsored medical research and conferences, ensuring that negative findings about smoking remained hidden for decades. It wasn't until the 1960s that the tide began to turn, when comprehensive studies finally revealed the devastating link between smoking and lung cancer, heart disease, and countless other conditions. But wait, there's more to this medical madness. Second fact: radioactive products were marketed as health tonics. In the early 20th century, radium was considered a miracle element. Companies added it to drinking water, chocolates, face creams, and even suppositories. Radium was believed to cure everything from arthritis to impotence. One popular product, Radithor, was a radioactive water drink endorsed by a prominent industrialist named Eben Byers, who consumed over 1,000 bottles. He eventually died a horrific death in 1932, his jaw literally disintegrating from radiation poisoning. His skull had to be buried in a lead-lined coffin. Despite such tragedies, radioactive toothpaste promised whiter teeth and healthier gums, while radium-laced cosmetics claimed to give women a natural glow. The fascination with radium only ended when its deadly effects became undeniable, but not before countless people suffered from radiation-induced cancers and bone diseases. And it gets more interesting. Third fact: lobotomies were performed on thousands of patients, including children. This brutal psychiatric procedure involved inserting an ice pick-like instrument through the eye socket into the brain, then wiggling it around to sever connections in the frontal lobe. Developed by Portuguese neurologist Antonio Egas Moniz, who won a Nobel Prize for it in 1949, the procedure was championed in America by Walter Freeman. Freeman traveled the country in his lobotomobile, performing the operation in mental institutions, often without proper surgical facilities. He believed lobotomies could cure everything from schizophrenia to rebellious teenagers and housewives suffering from depression. One of his most famous patients was Rosemary Kennedy, sister of President John F. Kennedy, who was left incapacitated after the procedure at age 23. Freeman performed over 3,000 lobotomies during his career. Patients often emerged from the procedure with severe cognitive impairments, personality changes, and the emotional range of a piece of furniture. The practice continued well into the 1970s in some countries. Here is an important detail. Fourth fact: asbestos was once called the magic mineral and used everywhere. This fibrous mineral was woven into clothing, mixed into building materials, sprinkled on cereal as a diet aid, and even used in children's toys. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the 1937 Disney film, used asbestos for the snow scenes. The Wizard of Oz featured asbestos snow falling on Dorothy and her companions. Parents bought asbestos-containing oven mitts and ironing board covers, believing they were purchasing the safest products available. Construction workers installed asbestos insulation without any protective equipment, breathing in the deadly fibers daily. The mineral was praised for its fire-resistant properties and affordability. Mining towns like Wittenoom in Australia were built around asbestos extraction, and entire families, including children, worked in the mines. Today, asbestos exposure is known to cause mesothelioma, lung cancer, and asbestosis. Thousands die each year from diseases contracted decades ago, with symptoms often not appearing for 30 to 50 years after exposure. And here's what's surprising. Fifth fact: cocaine was sold over the counter and marketed to children. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, cocaine was a common ingredient in patent medicines, soft drinks, and toothache drops. Coca-Cola originally contained cocaine, which was only removed in 1929. Parents gave their children Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which contained morphine to quiet crying babies. Cocaine toothache drops were advertised with cheerful images of children, promising instant relief. The drug was also prescribed for depression, alcoholism, and even hay fever. Sigmund Freud was a vocal advocate of cocaine, using it himself and recommending it to patients and friends. He later had to retract his enthusiasm after several people became addicted and one died. Pharmacies sold cocaine in various forms: powders, tablets, injections, and even wine mixtures. The Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 finally began regulating these substances, but the damage to countless lives had already been done. Now for the most curious part. Sixth fact: lead was deliberately added to gasoline, paint, and plumbing for decades despite known dangers. Thomas Migley Jr., an American engineer, developed leaded gasoline in the 1920s. He knew lead was toxic, but promoted it anyway because it was profitable. During a press conference to demonstrate its safety, he poured leaded gasoline over his hands and inhaled the fumes for 60 seconds, claiming it was completely harmless. What he didn't mention was that he had just spent months recovering from lead poisoning in Florida. Leaded gasoline became standard worldwide, releasing tons of lead particles into the atmosphere. Children living near highways showed significantly higher blood lead levels, leading to developmental issues, reduced IQ, and behavioral problems. Lead paint was used in homes until 1978 in the United States, and children who ate paint chips suffered severe neurological damage. The removal of lead from gasoline in the 1970s and 80s is credited with a measurable drop in crime rates decades later, as the generation exposed to less lead grew up with better cognitive function and impulse control. And that's not all. Seventh fact: heroin was marketed by Bayer as a non-addictive cough suppressant for children. Yes, the same pharmaceutical company that makes aspirin once sold heroin over the counter. From 1898 to 1910, Bayer promoted heroin as a safe, effective treatment for coughs, colds, and pain. The company claimed it was less addictive than morphine and codeine, which was catastrophically wrong. Heroin was advertised in medical journals and sold in neighborhood pharmacies. Parents administered it to their sick children without any understanding of its addictive properties. By the time authorities recognized the crisis, thousands were already dependent on the drug. Bayer discontinued heroin production in 1913, but the damage was done. The drug that was supposed to be a medical breakthrough became one of the most devastating substances of the 20th and 21st centuries. And here is where it gets really strange. Eighth fact: people were buried alive so frequently that special coffins were invented. In the 18th and 19th centuries, the fear of premature burial was so common that inventors created safety coffins with bells, flags, and breathing tubes. These devices allowed someone mistakenly buried to signal for help from underground. The fear wasn't unfounded. Medical knowledge was limited, and doctors sometimes pronounced people dead who were merely unconscious, comatose, or in deep cataleptic states. There are documented cases of coffins being exhumed only to find scratch marks on the inside of the lid, evidence that someone had awakened underground. Some safety coffins included glass windows above the deceased's face so cemetery workers could check for signs of life. Others had elaborate mechanical systems with strings attached to the buried person's hands, connected to bells or flags above ground. The phrase "saved by the bell" may have originated from this practice. Edgar Allan Poe's writings reflected this cultural anxiety as he frequently explored themes of premature burial in his horror stories. Let's dig deeper. Ninth fact: bloodletting was the standard medical treatment for almost everything. For over 2,000 years, physicians believed that removing blood from sick patients would cure their ailments. The practice was based on the ancient theory of humours, which held that health depended on balancing 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Doctors used lancets to open veins or applied leeches to draw blood. George Washington was likely killed by bloodletting. When he developed a throat infection in 1799, his doctors removed nearly half of his blood over a period of hours. The treatment weakened him so severely that he couldn't recover from what might have been a treatable infection. Bloodletting was used to treat fever, inflammation, headaches, and even mental illness. Barbers performed the procedure, which is why traditional barber poles have red and white stripes, symbolizing blood and bandages. The practice wasn't abandoned until the mid-19th century, when medical science finally proved it did more harm than good. Now pay attention. 10th fact: arsenic was a popular beauty product. Victorian women consumed arsenic wafers and applied arsenic-laced face creams to achieve a fashionably pale complexion. These products, marketed under names like arsenic complexion wafers, promised to remove freckles, blemishes, and give skin a translucent porcelain appearance. The arsenic caused severe health problems, including hair loss, nerve damage, organ failure, and death. Despite the obvious dangers, the beauty industry continued selling these products well into the early 20th century. Arsenic was also used in wallpaper dyes, creating the fashionable green colour seen in many Victorian homes. When the wallpaper became damp, it released toxic arsenic gas, poisoning entire families. Napoleon Bonaparte may have died from arsenic poisoning from the green wallpaper in his room during exile on St. Helena. The pigment, called Scheele's green or Paris green, was used in clothing, artificial flowers, and children's toys. Dancers performing in arsenic-dyed costumes sometimes collapsed on stage from exposure, and then another detail emerges. 11th fact: sending children through the mail was briefly legal in the United States. In the early 1900s, shortly after the US Postal Service introduced parcel post in 1913, some parents discovered they could mail their children to relatives for less money than train tickets. The first known case was in 1913 when a couple in Ohio mailed their 8-month-old son to his grandmother's house 11 miles away. The baby was classified as a parcel weighing 15 pounds, with 53 cents in stamps attached to his coat. He travelled in the mail cart and was delivered by the mailman. Several more cases followed, with children being mailed distances of up to 700 miles. The Postal Service eventually banned the practice in 1920, clarifying that human beings could not be sent as packages. However, the fact that it happened at all and that postal workers actually delivered the children reveals how different attitudes toward child safety and bureaucratic loopholes were a century ago. If you enjoy our videos about amazing facts, myths, and bold debunking of lies, support us with a like and write the number 1 in the comments. If not, write 0. This way we'll understand what interests you and make our episodes even better. And here's what raises questions. 12th fact: corpse medicine was widely used in Europe. For centuries, Europeans consumed human remains as medical treatments. Ground-up mummies from Egypt were sold in apothecaries and prescribed for various ailments. Human skull was powdered and mixed into drinks to cure headaches and epilepsy. Human fat was applied to wounds and consumed to treat joint pain. Blood from executed criminals was drunk fresh to cure epilepsy, with crowds gathering at executions with cups ready. The practice known as corpse medicine or medical cannibalism was common from the Renaissance through the 18th century. Even royalty participated. King Charles II of England had his own personal corpse medicine laboratory. The wealthy paid high prices for authentic mummy powder, leading to a black market where recently deceased bodies were passed off as ancient Egyptian mummies. The practice was justified by the belief that the life force or spirit contained in human tissue could cure diseases. It wasn't until the Age of Enlightenment that physicians began questioning whether eating human remains had any medical value. But there is another version. 13th fact: child labour was not only legal but expected. In the 1800s and early 1900s, children as young as 5 worked in factories, mines and mills for 12 to 16 hours a day. They operated dangerous machinery, crawled through narrow mine shafts to extract coal, and performed repetitive tasks in textile factories that destroyed their physical development. In Britain, children were sent into chimneys to clean them, often getting stuck or suffocating. Factory owners preferred hiring children because they could pay them less, and their small hands could reach into machines. Children working in match factories developed phossy jaw, a horrific condition where phosphorus in the matches caused their jawbones to literally glow in the dark and then rot away. The victims' faces would develop abscesses, their teeth would fall out, and the decay would spread through their skulls. Photographs from the era show children covered in coal dust, their growth stunted, their expressions blank from exhaustion. It wasn't until the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 in the United States that child labor was seriously restricted, though it still persists in many countries today. The next point is no less amazing. 14th fact: teeth were commonly pulled from dead soldiers and used as dentures. After major battles including Waterloo in 1815, scavengers would descend on battlefields to extract teeth from dead soldiers. These teeth, known as Waterloo teeth, were considered superior to ivory or animal teeth because they came from young, healthy men. Dentists purchased these teeth and fitted them into denture plates for wealthy clients. The practice was so common that dentists advertised their dentures as containing real human teeth from soldiers. For the poor who needed teeth, the only option might be to buy them directly from people willing to sell their own teeth for money. The trade in human teeth was a thriving business throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. Grave robbers also supplied dentists with teeth, removing them from recently buried corpses. It wasn't until porcelain dentures became widely available in the mid-1800s that the demand for human teeth declined. And here a new story appears. 15th fact: doctors didn't wash their hands before surgery. Until the mid-1800s, surgeons operated in their street clothes, often wearing the same blood-stiffened coat for years as a badge of experience. They didn't wash their hands or instruments between patients. Hungarian physician Ignác Semmelweis discovered in 1847 that hand-washing drastically reduced death rates from childbed fever, but his colleagues ridiculed him. The medical establishment rejected his findings because they couldn't accept that doctors themselves were spreading disease. Semmelweis died in an asylum, his theories vindicated only after his death when Louis Pasteur and Joseph Lister developed germ theory. Before antiseptic practices, surgery had a mortality rate of nearly 50%, not from the surgery itself, but from infections afterward. Hospitals were death traps where patients often contracted infections worse than their original conditions. Operating theatres were literally theatres, with medical students and the public watching from galleries while surgeons performed amputations and other procedures on conscious, screaming patients. Let's move on. 16th fact: schools used corporal punishment routinely and brutally. Teachers beat children with wooden paddles, leather straps, canes, and rulers for minor infractions like talking out of turn or failing to complete homework. In many schools, particularly in Britain and its former colonies, this was not just permitted but encouraged as character building. The cane was used on children's hands, backs, and buttocks, often leaving welts and bruises. Some teachers kept a record of which students had been punished and how many strikes they received. In the United States, corporal punishment in schools was legal in all states, until New Jersey became the first to ban it in 1867, but it took until 2018 for the last states to finally prohibit it. Even today, corporal punishment remains legal in private schools in some states. The psychological impact of this normalized violence affected generations of children, teaching them that physical pain was an acceptable response to mistakes or disobedience. And here's what's really interesting. 17th fact: freak shows displayed people with disabilities for entertainment. From the mid-1800s through the mid-1900s, circuses and traveling shows exhibited people with physical differences, genetic conditions, and disabilities as curiosities. They were called freaks and displayed in cages or on stages while spectators gawked and paid admission. People with conditions like gigantism, dwarfism, conjoined twins, and those with rare genetic disorders were often the only source of income for their families, forced to endure humiliation and live as attractions. Some performers, like General Tom Thumb, became wealthy and famous, but most lived in poverty and exploitation. Shows featured people with hypertrichosis, known as wolf people or dog-faced boys, individuals with severe scoliosis displayed as living skeletons, and others with various conditions. The famous Elephant Man, Joseph Merrick, was exhibited in London until a doctor rescued him and provided him shelter. These shows were considered normal family entertainment. It wasn't until changing social attitudes in the mid-20th century that freak shows declined, though some circuses continued displaying people with disabilities until the 1980s. The next detail may surprise you. 18th fact: electrical shock therapy was used to cure mental illness and homosexuality. Electroconvulsive therapy began in the 1930s and was often performed without anesthesia or muscle relaxants, causing patients to convulse so violently they broke bones and teeth. Doctors used it to treat depression, schizophrenia, and other conditions, but it was also weaponized against people whose only illness was being gay. Conversion therapy used electric shocks while showing patients images of same-sex couples, attempting to condition them to associate homosexuality with pain. These barbaric treatments were performed in hospitals, psychiatric institutions, and even some religious facilities well into the 1980s. Many patients suffered permanent memory loss, cognitive impairment, and psychological trauma. While modern ECT is performed humanely under anesthesia and can be effective for severe depression, the historical use of electrical shocks as punishment and correction represents one of medicine's darkest chapters. But there is a nuance. 19th fact: women could be institutionalized for almost anything. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, husbands, fathers, or male doctors could commit women to asylums for reasons including reading too many novels, excessive religious enthusiasm, imaginary female trouble, and simply disagreeing with their husbands. Once institutionalized, women had virtually no rights and could be held indefinitely without trial. Journalist Nellie Bly famously went undercover in 1887 at the Women's Lunatic Asylum on Blackwell's Island and exposed the horrific conditions. Patients were beaten, kept in freezing rooms, fed rotten food, and subjected to ice-cold baths as punishment. Many perfectly sane women were locked away for years because they challenged social norms, wanted divorces, or were inconvenient to their families. The criteria for female insanity in medical journals included behaviors like novel reading, political excitement, nymphomania, which could mean merely desiring sex with one's own husband, and egotism. Some women were committed for inheriting money that relatives wanted to control or for having ideas about women's suffrage. And here's another example. 20th fact: DDT was sprayed directly on people, including children and soldiers. Dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, better known as DDT, was hailed as a miracle pesticide after World War II. Public health officials sprayed it in neighborhoods, inside homes, on beaches filled with swimmers, and directly on children at summer camps. Film footage from the 1940s and 50s shows children running behind DDT fogging trucks, playing in the mist. The military sprayed soldiers with DDT powder to prevent lice and mosquitoes. Housewives were encouraged to spray it in their kitchens. DDT was in everything: wallpaper, shelf paper, and mixed into paint. At county fairs, vendors sprayed DDT on fairgrounds while families ate picnic lunches. The pesticide was even added to products like DDT wallpaper that continuously released the chemical. Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, published in 1962, finally exposed DDT's devastating environmental and health impacts. The chemical accumulated in the food chain caused birds' eggshells to thin and crack and was linked to cancer and reproductive problems in humans. The United States banned DDT in 1972, though some countries still use it. It's time to move on. 21st fact: tuberculosis patients were sent to fresh air camps and told to sleep outside. Before antibiotics, tuberculosis sanatoriums prescribed open-air treatment, believing fresh air would cure the disease. Patients, including those with active contagious TB, slept on outdoor porches in all weather conditions, even during winter snowstorms. They were bundled in layers of blankets while temperatures dropped below freezing. The treatment had some basis in logic. Fresh air and sunlight do have mild antimicrobial properties, but it was largely ineffective against advanced tuberculosis. Patients spent months or years at these sanatoriums, many dying from exposure, malnutrition, or the disease itself. Some facilities had cure chairs where patients sat motionless for hours in the cold. Photographs show rows of beds on open porches, patients barely visible under mountains of blankets, icicles hanging from the roof above them. The truly bizarre part is that some people did improve, likely those with early-stage infections whose immune systems fought off the disease naturally, which reinforced the belief in the treatment's effectiveness. Here hides an important point. 22nd fact: pregnant women were routinely given thalidomide, causing thousands of birth defects. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, doctors prescribed thalidomide to pregnant women for morning sickness, insomnia, and anxiety. The drug was marketed as completely safe, with no side effects. What followed was one of medicine's worst disasters. Thalidomide caused severe birth defects, particularly phocomelia, where babies were born with severely shortened or absent limbs. Over 10,000 children worldwide were affected, their arms and legs resembling flippers. Many also had defects in their eyes, ears, hearts, and internal organs. The pharmaceutical company had conducted inadequate testing and ignored early warning signs. While the United States largely avoided the tragedy because FDA Inspector Francis Oldham Kelsey refused to approve the drug, suspecting insufficient safety data, other countries weren't so fortunate. Germany, Britain, Canada, and Australia saw thousands of affected births. Some children with thalidomide syndrome became accomplished athletes, artists, and advocates, but many others died in infancy or lived with severe disabilities. The scandal led to major reforms in drug testing and approval processes. And here's what is usually not mentioned. 23rd fact: ice pick lobotomies were performed in hotel rooms and offices without anesthesia. Walter Freeman, mentioned earlier, believed lobotomies were so simple that they didn't require hospital settings. He developed the transorbital lobotomy technique using a common ice pick from his kitchen drawer. The procedure took about 10 minutes. Freeman would use electroshock to render the patient unconscious, then hammer the ice pick through the thin bone above the eye socket into the brain's frontal lobe. He'd wiggle it around to sever connections, withdraw it, and repeat on the other side. He performed some of these procedures in his office, in hotel rooms during cross-country tours, and even in patients' homes. He once performed 25 lobotomies in a single day. A photo shows him performing a bilateral transorbital lobotomy, using both hands to insert ice picks into both eyes simultaneously. He was eventually banned from performing surgery after his last patient died from a brain hemorrhage during her third lobotomy. Yes, third. Some patients underwent multiple procedures if the first one didn't work. Freeman died in 1972, never expressing regret for the thousands of lives he destroyed. There is a continuation. 24th fact: window displays featured live babies in incubators. In the early 1900s, premature infant mortality was extremely high. Hospitals lacked the equipment and knowledge to save preemies. An unusual solution emerged: baby incubator exhibits at amusement parks and World's Fairs. Entrepreneur Martin Cowney set up displays where premature babies were kept in incubators while spectators paid admission to view them. For decades, from Coney Island to the Chicago World's Fair, people could watch real premature infants struggling for life as entertainment. Remarkably, Cowney's exhibits actually saved thousands of babies. He provided advanced medical care that hospitals didn't offer, employed trained nurses, and returned healthy babies to their parents free of charge. The admission fees from curious spectators funded the operation. Parents desperate to save their premature infants brought them to Cowney, and his success rate was surprisingly high for the era. However, the ethical implications of displaying sick babies as attractions, even with good intentions, are deeply troubling. The exhibits continued into the 1940s, only ending when hospitals finally established proper neonatal intensive care units. And now, a fact that is rarely discussed. 25th fact: doctors endorsed cigarette brands in advertisements. Throughout the 1940s and 50s, tobacco companies didn't just claim doctors recommended their products, they hired actual physicians to appear in advertisements. One famous campaign stated, "More doctors smoke Camels than any other cigarette," complete with images of physicians in white coats. Another series featured individual doctors endorsing brands with statements like, "I switched to Philip Morris," or "For your throat's sake, smoke Lucky Strikes." Medical journals accepted cigarette advertisements, sometimes placing them next to articles about lung health. Tobacco companies sponsored medical conventions providing free cigarettes to attendees. They funded research at universities, carefully controlling which findings were published. Some cigarettes were marketed specifically to medical professionals. The American Medical Association accepted millions in advertising revenue from tobacco companies and resisted calls to condemn smoking until overwhelming evidence forced their hand in the 1960s. Doctors who smoked reassured patients that cigarettes were safe, creating a feedback loop of misinformation that killed millions. From this moment, the most interesting part begins. 26th fact: left-handed children were forcibly trained to be right-handed. Throughout history and continuing into the 20th century, left-handedness was considered a defect, a sign of the devil or evidence of moral weakness. Teachers tied children's left hands behind their backs or hit them with rulers when they used the wrong hand. In Catholic schools, nuns would slap students who reached for pencils with their left hands. Some schools forced left-handed children to wear mittens on their left hands to prevent them from using those hands to write. This correction caused psychological trauma, learning difficulties, and stuttering in many children. left-handers were called sinister, a word literally meaning left in Latin but also meaning evil. Some cultures believed left-handed people were in league with Satan. The practice of forcing children to switch-handedness was common in Western countries until the 1970s and continues in some cultures today. Research has since shown that forcing a hand change can cause neurological problems, reading difficulties, and emotional issues because it conflicts with the brain's natural organization. And then, an unexpected twist. 27th fact: radium dial painters licked their brushes to get fine points, poisoning themselves. In the early 20th century, young women were hired to paint watch and clock dials with radium-containing luminous paint. The paint glowed in the dark, creating a popular feature for timepieces. Supervisors instructed the women to use a technique called lip pointing, where they'd put the brush between their lips to create a fine point before dipping it in the radium paint. Each time they did this, they ingested radium. The girls were told the paint was harmless, even healthy. The factory owners and scientists who worked with radium used lead shields and tongs, but the dial painters received no protection. Within years, the young women began falling ill. Their jaws deteriorated, their teeth fell out, their bones fractured spontaneously, and they developed cancerous tumors. Their bodies literally glowed in the dark from the radium accumulation. When one of the radium girls died, her doctors had to take X-rays in complete darkness because her bones emitted so much radiation they exposed the film. The women sued their employers, and their court cases, particularly the 1928 case in New Jersey, established important precedents for workers' rights and corporate responsibility for employee safety. This moment changes everything. 28th fact: electroshock therapy was performed on children as young as 3 years old. Child psychiatry in the mid-20th century included using electroconvulsive therapy on very young children for conditions including what would now be recognized as autism, ADHD, or simply being difficult. Children as young as 3 received electroshocks, often without anesthesia. One documented case involved a 4-year-old boy who received 20 treatments. The justification was that children recovered faster than adults and wouldn't remember the experience. Some children received shock therapy multiple times per week for months. The practice continued in some institutions into the 1980s. Children couldn't consent to treatment, and their parents were often told it was the only option. Many of these children suffered permanent cognitive damage, memory loss, and severe psychological trauma that lasted into adulthood. Survivors have described the terror of being restrained and shocked, betrayed by the adults who were supposed to protect them. Let's look at the next point. 29th fact: cocaine drops were sold specifically for children's toothaches. Victorian advertisements show smiling children and reassuring parents, promoting cocaine toothache drops as an instant cure. The products came in attractive packaging, sometimes with illustrations of happy children. Drugstores displayed them prominently alongside other remedies. Parents had no idea they were giving their children a powerfully addictive stimulant. The drops were dissolved on the gum or tooth, providing pain relief but also producing cocaine's euphoric and energizing effects. Some formulations were strong enough that children likely experienced their first cocaine high during teething. The manufacturer, Lloyd Manufacturing Company, advertised their product as instantaneous cure with an illustration of 2 children playing. Another popular brand featured a child holding a balloon. These advertisements appeared in respectable publications and medical journals. It wasn't until 1914 that cocaine was finally regulated in the United States, but by then an unknown number of children had been exposed to the drug through these dental products. Let's move forward. 30th fact: mercury was a common treatment for syphilis and constipation. For over 400 years, from the 15th through the early 20th century, doctors treated syphilis with mercury compounds. Patients were rubbed with mercury ointments, inhaled mercury vapors, or received mercury injections. The saying, "a night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," referred to this treatment. Mercury is highly toxic, and the treatment often caused more suffering than the disease. Patients' teeth fell out, their gums receded, they drooled uncontrollably, developed tremors, and experienced dementia. Some died from mercury poisoning rather than syphilis. The medical profession persisted with mercury treatment because in early syphilis, patients sometimes appeared to improve, likely due to the disease's natural progression into latency rather than the mercury's effectiveness. Mercury was also given to children as a laxative in the form of calomel, causing countless cases of mercury poisoning. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from hat makers who used mercury in felt production and developed neurological symptoms from chronic exposure. Despite centuries of evidence that mercury was poisonous, doctors continued prescribing it until antibiotics finally offered a real cure for syphilis. Now, what is often hidden? 31st fact: doctors performed gynecological experiments on enslaved women without anesthesia. Dr. James Marion Sims, often called the father of modern gynecology, developed surgical techniques for vesicovaginal fistula by experimenting on enslaved black women in Alabama between 1845 and 1849. The women, including Anarcha, Betsy, and Lucy, endured repeated experimental surgeries without anesthesia. Sims claimed black women didn't feel pain the same way white women did, a racist myth that persisted in medicine for generations. Anarcha underwent 30 surgeries over 4 years. The women had no choice in participating. They were property with no legal rights. Sims later used anesthesia when treating white patients. He built a hospital and achieved fame and fortune from techniques developed through these experiments. Statues honoring Sims stood in multiple cities until recent years, when activists successfully advocated for their removal or recontextualization. His experiments exemplify the intersection of racism and medical ethics violations, where enslaved people's bodies were used for scientific advancement without consent, care, or acknowledgement of their humanity or suffering. 32nd fact: tuberculosis was romanticized as a disease of artists and beauty. Throughout the 19th century, tuberculosis, or consumption as it was called, was weirdly glamorized. Society believed TB made people more creative, sensitive, and beautiful. The disease caused weight loss, pale skin, bright eyes, and flushed cheeks, which fit Victorian beauty ideals. Artists and writers who had TB, like the Bronte sisters, John Keats, and Frédéric Chopin, were thought to have produced their best work because of the disease, not in spite of it. Young women tried to achieve the consumptive look through tight lacing, avoiding sunlight, and using makeup to appear pale and delicate. Some even claimed to have TB when they didn't, viewing it as romantic and poetic. The reality was horrifying. TB caused fever, night sweats, violent coughing that brought up blood, chest pain, extreme fatigue, and slow death by suffocation as the lungs deteriorated. Entire families were wiped out by the disease, which spread easily in crowded conditions. The romanticization prevented people from taking proper precautions and delayed serious research into treatment and prevention. 33rd fact: formaldehyde-laced milk was sold to families. Before pasteurization became standard in the early 20th century, milk was often contaminated with bacteria, especially in cities where it traveled long distances from farms to consumers. To prevent the milk from spoiling and showing obvious signs of sourness, some distributors added formaldehyde, the same chemical used to preserve corpses. Formaldehyde kept milk from curdling and masked the smell of spoilage, allowing dealers to sell old, contaminated milk as fresh. Consumers had no way to detect the additive. Formaldehyde-preserved milk poisoned thousands, particularly infants and children who consumed milk as a dietary staple. Symptoms included stomach pain, vomiting, and in severe cases, death. The scandal was exposed by Harvey Washington Wiley, chief chemist at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, whose Poison Squad experiments demonstrated the dangers of food additives. His work led to the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, establishing the foundation for FDA regulation. The revelation that milk dealers were essentially embalming their products from the inside while families unknowingly fed it to their children sparked public outrage and demonstrated the desperate need for food safety standards. And here we reach the conclusion of our journey through 33 practices that were once perfectly normal. Looking back, it's clear that what society accepts as normal or safe can be dangerously wrong. Many of these practices were defended by experts, endorsed by doctors, and accepted by entire cultures. Yet time revealed their horror. Some questions remain unanswered. How many current practices will future generations look back on with the same shock and disbelief? What are we doing now that seems normal but will be considered barbaric in 50 or 100 years? The history of normalized cruelty, ignorance, and exploitation teaches us to question authority, demand evidence, and never assume that common practice equals correct practice. Medical science, social norms, and ethical standards evolve, usually too slowly for those suffering under outdated systems, but they do progress. The terrifying normalcy of these 33 facts reminds us that progress isn't inevitable and that vigilance, compassion, and critical thinking are essential to preventing history from repeating its worst mistakes.